just received in our and further details of this continuing story. Just received in our this is the latest dispatch just received in our news.
Hello, and welcome again to the Clapback. No, this is not a show about how police treat unarmed black men. This is the only show that doesn't talk about the news. We talk to the news, and then we clap back at it, and then we talk a lot about white people. Now, I know that a lot of you watch this show think that I talk too much about white people, especially during a time like this when we should all be bringing the country together. And a lot of white people tell me that. And to prove my point, my male sapien friends always regurgitate this quote.
In 2008 and 2012, we showed that Dr. Martin Luther King had it right, which is that in America at our best, we judge people by the content of their color, the content of their character, not the color of their skin.
Okay, he messed it up a little bit, but I'm sure you understand where he's coming from. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't condemn the white people. And I'm always asking why white America deludes itself and how it rationalizes the evil it returns, which Martin Luther King would never say. Except he did. See, that quote is actually from MLK's book, Where Do We Go From Here, when he said, "Why does white America delude itself, and how does it rationalize the evil it retains? The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro." Now, King later went on to talk about how the black unemployment rate was twice the white unemployment rate, and how black schools were underfunded, and how black people had half the wealth of whites. But white people will tell you that we've made progress since then. They'll tell you that America is not racist anymore, and then they'll pull that content of the character quote out of their ass, or the one about little white boys and little white girls playing together, because, see, white people don't know shit about Martin Luther King, or racism, or black people. They think they do, but they don't. And you know how I know that? Because no white person who really knew Martin Luther King would really quote Martin Luther King, because the truth is, Martin Luther King didn't think too highly of white people, and white people didn't think too highly of him. So that's who's getting today's clapback. White people's Martin Luther King. This week, during the protests that gripped America, Martin Luther King III reminded people of when his father said,
"I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years."
How many summers like this one do you imagine that we can expect?
Well, I would say this: we don't have long. The mood of the Negro community now is one of urgency, one of saying that we aren't going to wait, that we've got to have our freedom. We've waited too long. So that I would say that every summer we are going to have this kind of vigorous protest. My hope is that it will be nonviolent.
But in turn, white people turned around and tweeted at Martin Luther King's son that his father would have said no such thing. And we can't forget about when Bill O'Reilly said this:
Dr. King would not participate in a Black Lives Matter protest.
Now, I don't blame this on white people, because they really don't know Martin Luther King. And the reason they don't know him is that, well, it's because they hated his fucking guts when he was alive. In August 1966, less than 2 years before King was gunned down, when a Gallup poll asked Americans for their opinion of King, 63% of Americans, white people, had an unfavorable opinion of the civil rights icon. And in October 66, 85% of whites said that civil rights demonstrations hurt Negroes more than they helped. By December, many whites had changed their minds, but 50% told Harris pollsters that Martin Luther King Jr. hurt the cause of Negro civil rights. So, why did King cause so much consternation among white people? Now, despite what they would have you believe, Martin Luther King never embraced this, like, all Americans bullshit. He was as pro-black as they came and spent much of his time calling out white people. Not only was he critical of the population of active racists, but he also reserved much of his scorn for those who sat on the sidelines doing nothing. Martin Luther King antagonized white folks by calling them out on their privilege. That's right, Martin Luther King knew about white privilege, and he even said, we must also realize that privileged groups never give up their privileges voluntarily. If we are victimized with the feeling that we can sit comfortably by the wayside and wait for the white man to voluntarily give us our justly deserved freedoms, we will be the victims of a dangerous illusion, which can only end up in a tragic disillusion. He also said, many of our white brethren are concerned only about the length of life, their preferred economic positions, their political power, their so-called way of life. And he said, there has never been a single solid, determined commitment on the vast majority of white Americans on the question of genuine equality for the black man. It's never been there. Yeah, Martin Luther King was a thorn in America's side. So what did this country do when a white supremacist killed him? They whitewashed him and turned him into a martyr. To be fair, this is not just white people's fault, because America is great at rewriting history. Black people have accepted the narrative without challenging it. We have swallowed their sugar-coated version of Martin Luther King Jr. that paints him as someone who fought hate by lying down and silently taking his beatings. And they don't give a shit about King because they don't give a shit about black people. And if they did, they know that the black unemployment rate is still double the white unemployment rate. They know that black schools are still underfunded. The average non-white school district receives $2,226 less per student than white school districts. So when any white person tells you they know what Martin Luther King would have wanted, they're talking about the one who marched on Washington, not the one who shut down garbage and transportation systems of major American cities. They're talking about the one who dreamed of little white girls, not the one who preached about a massive distribution of wealth. They're talking about the one who sang freedom songs, not the one who knew people wanted to kill him and said, fuck it. I mean, I've been to the mountaintop because they killed him. Martin Luther King, the Martin Luther King they are talking about is not even a black dude. He's just a dead, whitewashed ghost of a man with a bullet in the jaw. Because that's who white people fell in love with, and that's when they love us the most. And if you only ever notice, the only time you ever hear white people say Black Lives Matter is when a black person dies. And I say all of that to tell you this. The black Martin Luther King would have understood. He would have blamed the riots on racism. He would have blamed complacent white people. He would have blamed America. Now, how do I know that? Well, he told me.
So I will continue to condemn riots and continue to say to my brothers and sisters that this is not the way. Continue to affirm that there is another way. But at the same time, it is as necessary for me to be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which cause persons to feel that they must engage in riotous activities as it is for me to condemn riots. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots.
Speaking of Martin Luther King, if there's one thing we can all agree on, it was his dedication to nonviolence. Now, I can't lie. These recent protests were very violent, unlike those, unviolent protests back at the Civil Rights Movement. This is what the American education system teaches us, right? That nonviolence works. Even this student knows it. Watch this.
In 1955, the Montgomery Bus boycott went into action, and this is when African Americans refused to ride city buses in Montgomery, Alabama. This all started because of Rosa Parks, who wouldn't move to the back of the bus when a white person got on. And as a result of the boycott, the Supreme Court ordered Montgomery to integrate its bus systems. So this movement was effective for social change in not America, but just citywide.
See, anyone who's taken 11th grade American history knows that Rosa Parks sparked the Montgomery bus boycotts and proved that nonviolent resistance worked. Except, that's not even at all how it happened. 2 days after the Montgomery bus boycott ended, a white supremacist fired a shotgun at Martin Luther King. Now, the next day, on Christmas Eve, a black girl was attacked for riding a bus. 4 days after that, racists attacked 2 buses and shot a pregnant woman. 2 weeks later, the Klan started bombing black churches. So, the city stopped all the bus services. And then the KKK lynched Willie Edwards. And then when the city's services resumed, guess what happened? Just to be safe, black people sat on the back of the bus again for years to come. But the city passed more racist laws. They made it illegal for black people to play games against white people, including basketball, dominoes, dice, cards. To be fair, I feel like white people were probably getting their ass kicked anyway. I bet some nigga named James ran a pound on a white boy and stuck the big joker on his forehead in a game of spades, and that little white boy ran straight to a city council meeting. And I don't even know if white people play dominoes. Do white play dominoes? I know they're using to stand them up and then make those domino trays that fall down. I never understood that shit because I never understood the point of it. You can make the dominoes fall down. Yay, we won. Anyway, it wasn't just the Montgomery bus boycott. Every civil rights victory came with violence, and it wasn't just the black people. For instance, I'm sure you've heard how we won the right to vote, right? Black people marched from Selma to Montgomery, and then this happened.
Activist Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed during a peaceful protest march on February 26th. It was then that a man named James Bevel from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began organizing marches from Selma to Montgomery. The first march took place on March 7, 1965. It became known as Bloody Sunday because while the 600 protesters crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers and county posse attacked the unarmed marchers with billy clubs and tear gas.
In 1965, a march for voting rights in Selma, Alabama went down in history as Bloody Sunday. Congressman John Lewis led the march.
They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses, releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I was going to die.
And on November 13th, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that public bus segregation was unconstitutional and ordered Montgomery buses to integrate. On December 21st, 1956, one day after the Montgomery bus system was served the court's order, the boycott ended, and the city's black citizens resumed riding the buses.
The second march took place 2 days later, and Martin Luther King Jr. ended up leading the group of protesters to a church instead of continuing on, so they could seek federal protection to protest peacefully. That night, a white group beat and murdered civil rights activist James Reeb, a white minister from Boston who had come to Selma to join the marches. The death of Reeb caused a national outcry and put a spotlight on the civil disobedience in Alabama. Protesters demanded President Lyndon Johnson pass new federal voting rights that would allow blacks to vote without being harassed. President Johnson passed the bill on March 15th and then pledged federal protection for the protesters as they marched.
See, that's a great story about nonviolence. Except that's not how it went at all. See, when MLK turned that march around, he lost the trust of a lot of black activists. They told MLK, you don't even go here. In fact, there was a Montgomery activist named James Foreman, and he wasn't with that getting his skull cracked shit. So he called on activists from all around Montgomery and the country to come to Montgomery, and him and some activists from Tuskegee who were about that life, they marched right up to the Montgomery Capitol and told Alabama's racist-ass Governor George Wallace to go to hell. No, I'm not even really killing. They wrote him a letter to go to hell. And then Foreman went across the street and then he told all the black people this.
One man in this country that can stop George Wallace and those posses. We can present thousands and thousands of bodies in the streets if we want to. And we can have all of the soul force and the moral commitment around this world. But a lot of these problems will not be solved until that charitably over place called the White House begins to shake and gets on the phone and says, now listen, George, we coming down there and throw you in jail if you don't stop that mess. That's the only way it's going to be stopped. It's not just the sheriff of this county or the mayor or the police commissioner or George Wallace. This problem goes to the very bottom of the United States. And you know, I said it today and I will say it again. If we can't sit at the table, let's knock the fucking legs off. Excuse me.
Now, y'all know that made Martin Luther King mad as fuck. I mean, but what was he gonna do? He was nonviolent. So when George Wallace sicked the state troopers on the protesters this time, the protesters were ready. They threw bricks at the cops on horsebacks, and they had their own sticks. But this is the protest that convinced many senators and congressmen to vote for the Civil Rights Act, because it was like violence breaking out everywhere. So you've been led to believe that the nonviolent protest got us the right to vote, and it did, along with a few violent protesters. And that's the entire point. The civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement. In many ways, King was a figurehead, and some people like John Lewis adhered to nonviolence, and others like Floyd and Stokely Carmichael, they didn't. And it wasn't just the same with the civil rights leaders, it was the same with the protesters all over the country. They were nonviolent when they marched with King, and then they were about their life when they were with the Deacons for Defense or the Panthers or the Black Armed Guards in Monroe. God damn, I wish I really could just tell y'all the story about the Black Armed Guards. Anyway, it was the combination of this turmoil that made these civil rights changes, not just like nonviolence, but the reason they tell you about nonviolent resistance is because that's the side they want you to take. And there's nothing wrong with nonviolent resistance. But if you listen to like the whitewash history, they'll have you believe that it existed in a vacuum and everything you got came from nonviolence, and they conveniently leave out one thing. They resisted like a motherfucker. And speaking of resistance, at the center of these recent protests is George Floyd, who was killed by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin.
Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has been charged by the Hennepin County Attorney's Office with murder and with manslaughter.
Chauvin was the officer who kneeled on the neck of Floyd, an unarmed black man, for more than 8 minutes as Floyd begged that he could not breathe. Soon after, Floyd obviously had been killed. The charging document spelling out that Floyd was non-responsive for almost 3 minutes before Chauvin removed his knee from Floyd's neck.
We purposefully didn't show you the video because I personally find it disturbing, but I should issue this trigger warning. We're going to be describing violence in the next few minutes, although we promise not to show you any of the pornographic footage of the lynchings. But if any police officers are watching, don't worry, you'll be fine. See, while most of us might watch this kind of brutality and cringe, cops, they see it all the time because they do it all the time. And that's right. See, pressing their knee into someone's neck is like actually a thing with cops. I bet Colin Kaepernick is mad as fuck right now. He could have still been in the NFL if he'd have just used like a punter's neck as a knee rest. But anyway, take the department that Chauvin worked in. According to the police manual, officers are allowed to perform what they call a neck restraint, which they describe as compressing one or both sides of a person's neck with an arm or a leg without applying direct pressure to the trachea or airway or the front of the neck. Now, the manual says that they can do it anytime a subject is actively resisting or basically making it hard to control them.
Over the past 5 years, police records show that neck restraints were used at least 237 times since 2015, and 16% of those incidents resulted in loss of consciousness, similar to what we saw with George Floyd there. The data showed 3/5 of those subjected to neck restraints and then rendered unconscious were black.
That's right. 60% of the people who were choked out by a Minneapolis cop was black, and only 30% were white. Now, Minneapolis is only 18% black, which means that the people in Minneapolis were 6 times more likely to be rendered unconscious by a police officer's neck restraint. That's crazy. Minneapolis really out here like letting cops stone cold stun niggas just for acting like they don't want to go to jail. But this policy isn't exclusive to Minneapolis. Apparently, like kneeling on people's neck is a long-standing law enforcement tradition across the country. It's called prone restraint. Take Saturday night, for instance, when journalist Mac McKnight recorded a man who was either a police officer or a Derek Chauvin cosplayer doing the same exact move on a protester as bystanders begged the officers to stop kneeling on the dude's neck. Now, first of all, I don't believe that Mac McKnight is a real name. And if it is, he's got to be a street name for a superhero. You're not fooling me, Aquaman. I know that's you. And secondly, you know how fucking brazen you got to be to kneel on somebody's neck at the protest against kneeling on motherfuckers' neck? But prone restraints are not even close to being rare. Take James Medina, for instance. Medina, a Denver police officer, was fired after he was caught on surveillance footage with his knee on the neck of a woman who was incarcerated in the city jail. Well, actually, that's the short story. Medina held his knee on the woman's neck until she passed out on the jail floor for several minutes. Medina didn't call for medical assistance, and the reason he did it was just so he could take off the woman's shoes. Now, after the department's Tactics Review Board reviewed the videotape, and they said that Medina used appropriate force against the woman because she displayed active aggression toward him. Then they found a doctor to say the same thing before Denver's Deputy Secretary of Safety ordered Medina's termination, explaining that the cop used egregiously disproportionate force. But Medina appealed, and he got his job back with back pay. You think that's bad? That's not even the tip. On August 22nd, 2014, Denver, Colorado cop Chad Cinema wrote in his police report that he placed his knee on the back of the upper shoulders to restrain a subject. But the suspect complained so much that the officer was mean and brutal that the police checked footage just to be sure, you know? And surprise, surprise.
Officer Chad Cinema holding down a handcuffed suspect by driving his knee into the man's neck. Our partners at the Denver Post obtaining this video taken after that suspect apparently tried to kick the officer.
After the independent review board saw the footage, they recommended that Cinema receive significant discipline. Now, Cinema was disciplined. He even agreed with his punishment because he was suspended for 4 days. Days before Floyd's death, this happened in Kansas City, Missouri.
And breaking news right here at 6 o'clock, 2 KCPD officers have been indicted for assault in a case from last year. We investigated this story. This is video of the incident at the time, appearing to show 2 police officers slamming a woman's face into the sidewalk and kneeing her in the face.
And while they were charged, the local Fraternal Order of Police leaders called the prosecution a politically motivated prosecution. Man, this goes on all the time. Newark, New Jersey's Guide for Police Officers categorizes prone restraint as deadly force. They allow it, though. They allow a hold with a knee or other object to the back of a prone subject's neck in extenuating circumstances, though. The police department in Sarasota, Florida, they made a proactive move to outlaw the technique altogether. After they saw the George Floyd video, of course. But they must not have told their officers because, like, this happened after the George Floyd protest. Now, I'm going to warn you. Don't worry. This is not, like, violent or anything. I'm just warning you that this lady is not describing the George Floyd footage. I promise you. She's talking about a whole different tape.
So what's going on in the video? I'll tell you about it. There's a man, an African-American man, lying on the ground. His hands are cuffed behind his back. 3 white officers are there for the arrest. 2 are hovering just above him. They're on the ground with him. 1 has a knee on his neck. A 3rd officer is standing by.
Last year, the city of San Diego released a report that said its police officers used some form of a chokehold 574 times between 2013 and 2018. Now, the city is 6.5% black, but 26% of the people placed in a chokehold by the SDPD officers, they were black. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 23% of all police officers are allowed to use some form of a chokehold. So, if you think George Floyd's death was strange, it was only rare because it was caught on camera from multiple angles. Or, as Martin Luther King once said, I have a dream that one day these motherfuckers probably gonna choke me to death. Hey, don't debate me on this. That's what Martin Luther King would have wanted. And may the clapback be with you all. Amen.
This is the latest dispatch just received in our newsroom.